All right, good morning, and thank you for joining us for the S&T panel, ASNE 2016. My name's Nevin Carr. I retired from the Office of Naval Research about 4 years ago and played for 2 years before joining Leidos last year. It's an honor to moderate this panel, especially with such a great group. We're really excited to have this particular lineup. Just by way of quick introduction, on my immediate right is Admiral Matt Winter. As you all know, he's the current Chief of Naval Research. He graduated from Notre Dame and the Naval Postgraduate School. He was the Deputy Program Manager for JSOW and TLAM All-Up Rounds, or Tomahawk All-Up Rounds, and was the Program Manager for PMA 201 before achieving flag rank, where he commanded the Naval Air Warfare Center Weapons Division in China Lake, was the PEO for unmanned aviation and strike weapons, and so it was probably no accident that he wound up at the Office of Naval Research right about the time when the Defense Department is recognizing the power of autonomous and unmanned systems going forward. The right man at the right time. On his right, Dr. Gulu Gambhir is the Chief Technology Officer for Leidos. He's a graduate of the University of Virginia and got his Doctor of Science at George Washington, where he continues to teach and lecture. Prior to joining Leidos, he was with Northrop Grumman. Before that, Space Application Corporation and ComSat. And Gulu has been with Leidos as the CTO since about 2009. Of course, we spelled Leidos with an S back in those days, but I like our current name better. To Gulu's right is Vice Admiral retired Paul Sullivan. Admiral Sullivan went to the U.S. Naval Academy and also got a master's degree from MIT. Most importantly, he was a surface warfare officer originally, qualified before he became an engineering duty officer, sub-qualified engineering duty officer. He was the Virginia Submarine Program Manager and the Seawolf Submarine Program Manager. And his final flag job was as the 41st Commander of the Naval Sea Systems Command. And I had the pleasure of working firsthand with him and seeing what his special brand of strong, positive leadership was able to do at a time of great turmoil at NAVSEA. Brian Clark is currently a senior fellow at CSBA, the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Brian enlisted in the Navy in 1982, went to the University of Idaho and got a Master of Science from the National War College. He had various positions of increasing responsibility and influence, including Executive Officer of the Moored Training Ship, the ex-Sam Rayburn, before his talents were recognized and he was pulled in to help run the Quadrennial Defense Review, and from there became a special assistant to CNO John Greener and had tremendous influence on some of the major changes in the Navy on Admiral Greener's watch. He's going to represent sort of the Washington thought leadership view. And last but not least, Admiral Joe Vovedich from the Coast Guard. Joe is a native of South Korea, graduated from the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, got his Master of Science from Purdue University, that other university in Indiana. He was a non-resident graduate of the Naval War College and the Industrial College of the Armed Forces. Prior to his current responsibilities, he was the commanding officer of Coast Guard Sector Long Island and was the PEO for all Coast Guard acquisition programs. And he's now the Assistant Commandant of the Coast Guard for acquisition and also their Chief Acquisition Officer. So we have a lineup. The interior Navy view, certainly Admiral Winter knows that better than anybody else for S&T. Dr. Gambhir for the industry perspective. Admiral Sullivan, who's currently in academia, but certainly can speak to all those different viewpoints. Brian Clark, thought leadership, the current view from think tanks in Washington, and then Admiral Vovedich for the Coast Guard view and the special challenges that the Coast Guard faces in getting the promise out of S&T. Now, I only have one slide, and that's it right there, just to kind of tee up the discussion. And that is a picture of National Science Foundation data that was collected from 1963 to 2008. It's a little bit old, but it still tells a pretty compelling story. There's no scale on the ordnance because it's percentage, it's pro rata share. So if you look at who was funding R&D back in 1963, the government was handing big bags of money to industry, and they were being very specific about the requirements that the government wanted serviced by the R&D community. So technology flows pretty cleanly in that model. If the government's able to say, here's what I want and here's the money to do it. That was the day of large programs like the space program, nuclear weapons, strategic bombers. Industry back then was about 25 to 30%. And you can see from this picture, there was a little toe up on the red line as it declined. That's the Reagan years. And then another toe up right after 9/11, but an undeniable trend. So we pretty much traded places in this picture between industry and government. So to the point today where those requirements are not being dictated by the government anymore, they're being dictated by you, the consumer, and the government has to keep up. So how do you do that when you don't control where technology is going? And technology in general, on the left side of that picture, flows from government requirements to the commercial market, like radar became microwave ovens, and GPS obviously now has crept into our lives. On the right side, technology flows from the market demand to government use, very different model. So you might think about where the 5000.1 series lives on that picture. The little blue line on the bottom, that's Elon Musk and people like that. So I'll just use that as a scene setter and hand it over to Admiral Winter for his remarks. Thank you.
I think I'll just sit here. Okay, thanks. Thanks, Admiral Carr, and ladies and gentlemen, thanks for taking time out of your day to join us here. I'm honored to be on the stage with the assembled panel here. It's truly an assembly of great minds in areas of responsibility focused on our science and technology and research and development investments. As the Chief of Naval Research, I'm given the responsibility for the stewardship, execution, and delivery of the science and technology portfolio for the Department of the Navy. So that's Navy and Marine Corps. Today I'd like to just briefly give you an overview of our strategic framework, the Office of Naval Research, where those investments, as Admiral Carr mentioned, have been going over the last 25 years, where I see the barriers and the opportunities today and in the future, and then wrap up with some neat science that's being done underneath the auspices of the Office of Naval Research. So as we look in the annals of history, we always have a strategic dialogue and a strategic discussion. Currently, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, Commandant of the Marine Corps, and the Chief of Naval Operations collectively have come together in the Cooperative Strategy 21st Century Strategic Guidance for our forces, depicted there up to the upper left. That remains valid and remains in play, as we've also turned over a new Commandant and new CNO last fall. Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Richardson's focus is to take that strategy and look at how the implementation of that strategy can be more strategic to tactically connected. In that, we released the Navy, a design that takes that strategic document and aligns lines of effort along people, organization, and mission attributes within the Navy. And you can see that depicted on the right-hand side with the circle and the 4 bullets that have the lines of effort. Operations is the first, people is the second, the organizational, industry, academia, military partnerships is the fourth. And I'll draw your attention to the 3rd bullet that talks about high velocity learning, talks about learning faster and better, and innovate naturally, versus telling your workforce and your sailors and Marines to be innovative, where you go, okay, everybody's got their own definition. Understanding how you can establish a culture of open, inclusive, collaborative environment that allows the workforce, sailors, Marines, and civilians to critically think on the hardest problems we have to generate solution space that then emerges innovative ideas and innovative solutions. That is all underpinned by our science and technology strategy that remains valid, and we continue to review and update through the Office of Naval Research with our fleet and force commanders and our naval research and development establishment, which I'll talk about. But it's important to understand there is strategy to task. And strategies need to be reviewed and understood, not just put on the shelf. And the Department of the Navy, and specifically the Navy, continues to do so in this manner. So the Office of Naval Research, for those that are not for those, I see a lot of familiar faces out there. This is what I call the slide, right? It's like the one thing. If you can brief your organization in a single slide. The Office of Naval Research is the S&T, Science and Technology provider for our Marines and Navy sailors. Organized in 4 organizational elements depicted by the 4 logos that you see there: headquarters, a special projects office, a global environment, and the Naval Research Laboratory. 4,000 scientists and technologists plus over 23 locations around the world, partnering with industry and academia, and taking the mere resources of $2 billion. Sounds like a lot of money, right? I'm going to show you the scale of those $2 billion and how those dollars stretch to do the discovery, development, and delivery of the technological breakthroughs and the new knowledge that gives our sailors and Marines the tactical advantage. So, all of that said, the who, I mean, I get a lot of great ideas presented to me in all different venues. And the question I ask is, who are the performers? Who's going to do the work? Because I've got lots of ideas, and we've got some money to go do those ideas. But if the individuals and the organizations are already tapped out, we can't sit there and say we're going to continue to move this forward. So we need to understand the performers. And in our Department of Navy S&T community, it's a simple triad: government, industry, academia. And as you think about basic research, flubber and flux capacitors, petri dishes and test tubes, right? The discovery and invention of new knowledge, that's a predominantly academic environment with our government agencies. And as we migrate with that new knowledge and it knits into technologies that we want to apply and see it start to morph into a feasible capability, our industrial base really comes into play in understanding how we bring that together in experimentation and demonstration and prototyping. But through both of those, that spectrum, are government entities. And in that, I include our UARCs, our FFRDCs, and our sister service S&T organizations, our naval research and development establishment, such as warfare centers and system centers, naval research laboratories, PEOs and PMs, all come together to be able to do this work. And that spectrum of partnership and performers, small, medium, and large in the industry base, and academia here and around the world, is a focus area for the Office of Naval Research to minimize technological surprise, to leverage off of the intellectual capital and capabilities of those performers, to take that $2 billion and actually see a 3 to 4x return on investment, and we'll talk about that. So, no bucks, no Buck Rogers, right? Don't have the dollars, not really going to go anywhere. So here's the data. Last 25 years, Department of Navy's R&D profile, now this is just R&D, across the spectrum there, it really shows a slight increase, as you saw Admiral Carter's, and then a leveling off and a slight decline. Don't focus as much on the blue line as the red line. Department of Defense is, for even then-year dollars, about $12 billion of science and technology dollars coming out of the President's budget. President's budget's anywhere between, it's been as high as 92, and right now I think the 17 budget on the Hill is around 70 to 75 billion dollars. 12 of that comes to the Department of Defense. And then we further subdivide that, about $2 billion for Air Force, Army, Department of Navy, and then subsequently DARPA and some other DoD agencies. What does that mean? Does that mean our buying power, investment power, our science and technology resources, even though constant over 25 years has eroded? You can come to that conclusion. But I can also come to the conclusion that with that reality, that 1% of a venture capitalist investment for a corporation to remain relevant and dominant, it generates the necessity to be more efficient get rid of efficiency. We need to be more, we have to be clever, and we have to be able to get that 3 to 4x for every dollar. And I'm going to show you how we do that. Okay, S&T investment priorities. I get two questions normally when I go anywhere. What keeps you up at night, and what are your priorities? So, our adversaries, global actors, non-state actors, and the war-fighting concerns that they bring to the table don't keep me up at night. Those keep up our fleet forces and our numbered force commanders as they should. Keeps me up at night is inefficiency. The inefficiency to take that $1 and get $5 a return and be able to get that technological advantage in a sailor or Marine's hand as fast as possible. To do that, the business of the science, right? The science of the science continues to innovate, to discover, and to deliver. But then we hit the belt sander of policy and contract types and dollars and lines of accounting. We need to make sure that we're focused on the business of science efficiencies as much as the ability to truly identify those breakthrough technologies. So my investment priorities there that you see are across the spectrum of areas that you can drive a truck through, actually. In each of those, we have anywhere between 50 to 150 individual projects, initiatives, and activities ongoing across that triangle of performers. It's important that we look at that execution and in our methodology take the thought that S&T, science and technology, is domain agnostic. So as we look at our railgun for electric weapons or laser cannons, right? When we look at those capabilities, those technologies that matured and we were able to bring them into a feasible capability, what we find is that the optics, this energy storage, the advanced materials for advanced electronics for control systems in those applications are absolutely applicable to unmanned systems and to some of our EMC and EMS and EMW solution space. It's important that we keep that domain agnostic DNA in our science and technology optics. That's part of getting that 2 to 3 to 4x ROI, so that we don't duplicate and that we leverage off internally as well as with our partners from industry and academia. Some of the exciting activities that are ongoing across the investment priorities are things such as in our synthetic biology, being able to take 3D printers. Actually, NRL scientists just 2 months ago recognized for his ability to take live tissue and 3D print arteries, veins, and capillaries. The ability to transition organic material that digests ferrometallic material and then poops electricity. The ability to say how on a nanoscale to be able to have nano gates in our photonic research lab to be able to truly bring up the game-changing data rates and reduction of thermal property so that we can have the next generation, I'll say the next 3 generations of advanced electronics computing power, which will enable our naval tactical cloud and big data analytics, which falls into our cyber domain. So you can see that we've weaved across and we make sure that we're leveraging the science and the research, the discovery and the application, and the feasible capabilities across these priority areas to maintain the technological advantage. So I've been asked about the third offset, and now this will be my second to last slide. The 4 boxes you see in the center of the slide are underpinned by the x-axis of the 3 fleets of forces that a science and technology, the Office of Naval Research, has in their mission. The current fleet, fleet under development, and our future fleet. The red box depicts our investment strategy for basic and discovery, basic research for discovery and invention, predominantly in the academic domain. That looks at what do we have in our petri dish today that we're going to fight with in 15 to 30 years, or accelerate to bring it closer, but that's the focus. And in that, we have our performers between 4,000 and 5,000 academic grants annually to academic institutions here and around the world. to generate that new knowledge, to generate that capability, the technologies that then give us the capabilities. And then the two center boxes are our innovative naval prototypes, more technology push. No warfighter actually asked for a railgun until they saw a railgun, right? And laser cannons, and LDUVs, and cyber effects, and some of our other technology pushes. But as we bring them forward in maturity and we get our warfighters involved, they start pulling that across. We have challenges in getting it across, and we'll talk about that on the last slide. And then in the gold box, our technology pull that's specifically helping those programs of record that need to maintain their feasibility, their maintainability, reliability, and affordability while they're in the development process. And then finally, the blue box is our quick reaction technical solutions for boots on the ground and sailors underway that have issues and concerns that science and technology can solve. So with that as a backdrop, we've had a number of engagements with the Secretary of Defense and the DepSecDef on the rollout here in PB17 of the third offset strategy. I'm not going to go through the history of the second and the first, and you can read that. If you've already read Secretary Work's comments, you're well aware of that. What's important to understand here is how do we take what we currently have, knit it together in a different way to get an orthogonal, different outcome. Examples of being able to take the Block 4 Tomahawk and understand how we could change its periodicity of communication and be able to turn it into a moving maritime target capability for a short-term capability gap. Being able to look at our science and technology investments, and what you see in the flyouts here are the current projects, initiatives, technology maturation efforts underway today that are aligned to the man-machine interface for electromagnetic maneuver warfare, for cyber effects, offensive and defensive, for our unmanned systems to complement manned systems in all domains, undersea, surface, air, space, and also have unmanned systems that are in the cyber domain. We have to stop thinking about an unmanned system as a USB stick, right? Unmanned systems are systems that are unmanned, that breach the boundary of traditional thought. So as we think about those along those lines, these are the projects that we continue to invest in. The Department of the Navy, along with the Army and the Air Force, but the Department of the Navy is at the forefront of putting forward the technologies that are maturing to realize the third offset strategy direction from the Secretary of Defense. And we're really excited about that, and I'll take questions on that during the Q&A period. And then finally, as we get off the stage, there's been a number of conversations about basic research. And I want to drive home the point to this audience and wherever I can, that basic research remains the fundamental DNA of everything that we need, everything that we do. Our valley of death, non-transitioning optic, I see as more as a moat at best. The fact of the matter is, if we have such a valley of death, we should be rowing in wooden boats and wearing life preservers right now. We've got a pretty formidable Navy, Coast Guard, and Marine Corps out there. So something's transitioning. What we need to understand is how we can more expeditiously transition that back to the business of the science and the science of the science. And then understand where the true game-changing basic research areas should be, so that you can see in this chart the advanced materials, photonics, quantum sensing, 3D printing technologies, as we continue to mature those in the basic research and be able to accelerate those through to bring true warfighting capability, either new breakthrough like railgun, or continue to augment current capability that's in our sailors and Marines' hands. So with that, a good snapshot of the Office of Naval Research, our current investment strategy, how it ties to senior leadership strategy, some of our investment priorities, and some of the projects that are currently ongoing. And I look forward to taking your questions during the Q&A.
We'll hold questions till the very end.
During the Q&A session at the very end. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll stand up, stretch my legs a little bit. So the comments I have are very much in line with what we've just heard. So let me have you do a thought experiment here. Advance the slide. Let's see.
I was pushing down there.
Pointed at that.
All right. There we go. All right, so take a look at these. These are paper titles that I found from the Journal of Advances in Physics. So I just found 9 articles, and there is a theme, but let me give you a moment to read through these titles, and you're all smart people here, see if you can figure out what the theme is. Let me extend it a little bit more. This is from IEEE, and another set of 9 papers I found. And so here you'll see that it's still scientific research. There's a combination of more basic science and in this case, a little bit more application. And you can see it has accelerometers, cameras, communications, power. How do these connect to one another? So if we take the basic science from the Journal of Physics, it's basic and a little bit of applied, and then we look at the IEEE, which is very much applied research, and we combine these two with some additional research, with some additional development, what we get is a modern cell phone. So the advances that we take for granted today in terms of what your phone can do from a power point of view, the display, the camera, the accelerometer, the GPS, the communications at very high, remarkable speeds really, those are all enabled by advances in basic science. And were it not for those advances in basic science, we wouldn't have the application of the phone or a ship or an aircraft. And so there's an innovation pipeline, a scientific pipeline that has to see its way through to mature these technologies from being basic to more advanced. And so you all know Apple. Last year, Apple declared in 1 quarter of its financial results that it sold 61.2 million iPhones in 1 quarter, in 3 months, which was up 40% from the 3 months of that same period earlier that year, of the prior year, at an average price of $659. So do the math, 61.2 million phones at an average price of $659. That's $40.3 billion in a quarter. You need scientific notation to keep track of this kind of stuff. $40 billion in a quarter. And it comes from science. And were it not for the science, we wouldn't have this application that we, again, take for granted today. So I think just about all of you are familiar with this DoD research model, the 6.1 through the 6.5. That's the formalization of the science to engineering life cycle. And of course, budgets are aligned to this. And as Nevin Carr pointed out at the start, there's a government role and there's an industry role in this. And when I think about that, and here I characterize academia and industry, the focus is on academia and industry, funded largely by the government on the left-hand side of this. And as we move to the right side, and I'll say as an industry representative on this panel, we don't have the luxury of making investments from an industry point of view in basic research, in part because the outcomes are uncertain, as you just heard in the prior presentation. When you do the basic research I showed in the first 9 papers, it wasn't clear that those would necessarily lead to an advance that you could implement in a phone one day. So that payoff is unclear, which from an industry point of view makes it difficult to invest in those. In addition to the lack of clarity on the potential payoff, the timelines to go from basic research to payoff are also long, and generally speaking, longer than most industry can afford. And if you harken back to the days of Bell Labs, in that case when you had a monopoly infrastructure with a lot of money, a lot of profit, you were able to make those investments in basic research. But today that's not really possible. So again, from an industry point of view, I'd like to talk a little bit about the portfolio approach that I take to my modest R&D budget of about $40 million per year. So I think about technology in these 4 kind of categories. One is developing products that we can sell to our customers. And in that case, we build something one time and we sell it many times. That's what I think of as a product. It's something you maintain in inventory, or again, you can sell the identical version multiple times. A solution is where we create a core offering or have a core capability that we expect to use for a variety of solutions, for a variety of customers. So as an example, some of you are familiar with the ACTUV program, autonomous unmanned maritime vessel, 130 feet long, that we're doing for DARPA right now. Just hit the water a couple weeks ago for some trials. In that, we're doing some work in autonomy, and that's where, from a company point of view, we're making our big investments. In some cases, when we look at our customers and where they're going, we see commonality in a few different customer lanes, and in that case, we make an investment. I call that sport to key pursuits. And then lastly, to keep this innovation engine primed is what I think of exploratory research and development. And as a CTO, I allocate about 10% of our overall R&D funds here, so about the $3 or $4 million. And I do that by crowdsourcing within the company and awarding contracts, projects at $50,000 and up to any employee that has an idea that looks like it may be promising, that takes advantage of a technology that has the potential to solve a customer problem. Some of you are familiar with George Halemeyer, director of ARPA. Of course, ARPA became DARPA. Now, the color is a little bit hard, and you can see some crossouts on here. These have been used at DARPA, ARPA, IARPA, many research and development organizations. So you may have seen these before. What I've done is I've tailored this for a commercial application, for an industrial application. So I'll just focus on the changes. Number two, George would ask, how is this done today and what are the limitations of current practice? From an industry point of view, I ask, well, who are our competitors? What is their capability today and where do you think they'll be in the future? So we may improve our ability to do something from an R&D viewpoint, but if our competitors are ahead of us, that won't help us in the marketplace. So we really have to assess where we are with regard to the competition. And number four, George would ask, who cares if you're successful, what difference does it make? From an industry viewpoint, we ask, what's the business impact if this is successful? What customer problem do we solve? And then how do we improve our standing with the customer? So when we innovate, when we develop something new, whether it's on the scientific side of the R&D spectrum or on the application side, there are some success factors that are universal. All things being equal, the less complex an innovation is, the more likely to be used. Another one I'll highlight is trialability. Trialability is the ability to experiment with an innovation without it having it really perturb your ongoing business operations. So as an example, if you have a mobile phone, most of you do, you go to an application store, they may have two versions of an app, a free version and a 99-cent version. I don't know about you, but I usually start with the free version and I try it out, right? So from a trialability viewpoint, you can see if it adds value to your context. And lastly, I'll highlight relative advantage. So when an innovation is created, often we look at what advantage that provides to us over the status quo. So for example, video teleconferencing has been around for a long time. Many of us can do it at our desktops now, but probably more often than not, we tend to just use voice. And why is that? Well, voice is probably good enough for most of the communication that we need to do. So when we do innovate, that's something that we have to consider. And lastly, I want to just transition a little bit to this topic of commercial technology and how we think about that in kind of a government context. So I've been working in the national security domain for 25 years. At a time, well, some of you will remember in the late 80s, early 90s, where we had dial-up modems on our computers at home where you would get 14.4 kilobits per second. And I get a clearance and I start working in the intelligence domain and I learned the term gigabit per second. Meanwhile, at home, I'm using kilobits per second. So significantly, orders of magnitude difference. And there was a time for many years through the Cold War where the government enclave, and I think about that as a castle, had a substantial advantage over what we were seeing in industry from a technology viewpoint. And we capitalized that for the advantage of our country, from an advantage of the national security. But over time, particularly in the late 20th century, the advent of the consumer technology-driven market really came to be. And so computers led that way. We moved into the internet era, and today we're in the mobility era, and this continues to evolve. So when I shared the results from Apple, $60 billion in a quarter, we're now in a consumer-driven era where that secure enclave is no longer there to protect the technologies that we hold so dear to us in national security. And so as this has changed over time, our reaction on the government side, of course, has to adopt to it. And it's difficult in many cases. So imagine if you're building an intelligence collection system against a signal, and that signal is evolving every 6 months or every 2 years, or perhaps even faster, and it takes you 3 years to build that system, we're always going to be behind. So we have to seek new ways to be innovative, to keep up with this really rapid pace of technological innovation driven by industry. And I hope that's a theme we can explore a little bit during the Q&A session. I think that's really interesting. So thank you for the chance to share a few comments with you this morning.
Good morning. Nevin, thanks for having me. Great to be on the panel here. I sometimes think of myself as a lost soul because typically I've been next door on the flexible warships panel, the campaign I've been on for quite some time. But I guess since I'm a lab director now, I get to come over here this morning. A couple things I want to talk about today. One is just the university-affiliated research centers, of which I'm the director of one. Say that 5 times backwards. We typically are involved in the developmental part of the R&D piece, so we're a little bit up towards the 6.4 end of things. And we are also frenemies, if you could call that, with other Navy-affiliated entities, and I'll talk about that a little bit. I wanted to talk first, though, about when you're talking about development and rapid prototyping, there's a couple of different flavors, and we shouldn't mistake one flavor for another flavor. And I want to make sure that I at least step through that today. And then I want to talk about, well, who's doing that, and who are the people that are all basically at Admiral Winter's door competing for funds, as he's got, I'll say, $10 to $12 billion worth of requirements to go fit that $2 billion that he talked about into. If you see all the projects that are coming out of ONR, and the miracle is, with only $2.1 billion, how the heck are we getting all this stuff done? So that's, and then a couple of extra thoughts on the other end. So let me just first talk about that. And this is just as I've watched as a program manager, and then out in private industry working on a centrifuge program, and then as I've come back to be a UARC director. Bottom up development. This is the hard stuff, where you start from the basic physics, discovery and innovation, and you evolve that through a long program, usually long, of getting the basic science right, and then deciding that really there is a capability there that has a military application, through some prototyping, and then you get it out to the fleet, and then you've got to go make it work correctly. All right, so a couple of examples there are the railgun and the directed energy weapons, which the Admiral is deeply involved in all of that. The next thing I'll say is the enhancement. Okay, so now you got an existing technology, and you want to go couple that with something that's emerging out of the science field. All right, so you don't have to build the new platform, but you have to adopt it to a new mission, and you can do that by injecting some new technology. That's usually a little bit faster. And if you look at, I love the B-52, and it was built when, you know, some of us folks with gray hair or no hair were kids. But the B-52 program manager has a really neat job because, hey, give me 10 million here and I'll put a new capability on the airplane. Give me 30 million the next year, I'll put another new capability on the airplane. And that's being pointed out as, hey, if we have an Arsenal plane, maybe that'll be it, because it's a great truck, okay? So the B-52 that we knew as kids, some of us up here anyway, is a much different airplane than what's flying out there today, and is absolutely combat relevant today because of smart additions and new technology to that platform. And I'll say Aegis BMD, when Admiral Meyer thought up Aegis, I don't think he had ballistic missile defense in the mix, but with a new software package and a bunch of smart development by some folks in this room, we got the ballistic missile defense mission without having to have an entirely new system of ships, radars, and missiles. Then there's acceleration, okay? If you have a tech base, and I'll toot my own horn here a little bit for a program that we're working on at Penn State, where you have a long development of a basic tech base with some visionaries that are in charge of that tech base, and I'll mention an ONR person for this example. It's a Teresa McMullen in your shop. For 20 years, that person stewarded along the basic technology for building a small torpedo that could actually go out and kill an incoming torpedo. And then when CNO, John Greenert said, okay, get this on an aircraft carrier as soon as you can, the community was ready because the tech base was ready. All right, so everybody looked like a superhero, and oh my gosh, we took this thing from nothing to deployment on an aircraft carrier in just a couple of years. That doesn't happen without the basic underlying spade work that has to be done year after year after year. That's what your ONR is really for. Combination, A plus B equals C, or 2 plus 2 equals 8. There's another way to get new mission capability from folding 2 existing technologies together, and SSGN is a really good example of that, where we took 4 Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines offline, and then converted them, refueled them, and overhauled them, and then figured out a way to put 7 Tomahawk missiles in each one of the tubes, okay? Were the Tomahawks pre-existing? Yes. Was the Ohio class pre-existing? Yes. So in this case, it was an integration of 2 existing weapon systems to get something brand new. And again, that didn't take decades. It took 5 to 10 years to get all 4 of them deployed. A radical new capability out there for the fleet. And then I guess I'll call rapid prototyping. Make sure you know which pieces that you need to prototype. And this is where you're doing collections of piece parts, I'll say. The F-117 Nighthawk, I know it's out of commission now. They've decommissioned the squadrons. But putting that airplane together using piece parts from the F-15 airframe and other aviation platforms, coupled with the new technology of stealth, really got us a great capability done in the classified world fairly rapidly. But again, you didn't take risk where you didn't need to take risk because the basic platform and engines were already out there, but what we did was adopted the new technology. Not quite as simple as I'm letting on here, but you get the picture. So who does this stuff? When Admiral Winters folks, and one nice thing about ONR is long-term program managers. They have the vision of more than 2 years. They're not rotating every couple of years. Who are the folks that they see to go deploy their cash across to try to get the best stuff for the Navy? And so I've listed the Naval Warfare Centers there. I think I got them all. And then then the Naval Research Laboratory. Well, you might say, well, geez, they got their own captive lab. Picture you're the kid of the soccer coach, okay? So if you think NRL doesn't have to go justify every single thing they do to the Admiral here, I would tell you to think again. They almost get more scrutiny than anybody else. Now the UARCs, that's where I'm the director of one of them. They're 100% soft money. And we have NAVC and ONR contracts with ceilings on them, but anyone can go task us via those contracts. But it's soft money, if we're only as good as our next proposal or our last delivery. And some of us have a checkered track record, some of us do well, and it really depends project by project. And then there's the FFRDCs, which are a budget line item, but they have a firm ceiling. So what tends to happen with the FFRDs is people stuff work in there, and they've got, okay, here's my ceiling, I've got this many FTE, and I've got twice as much FTE work as I have ceiling, so they're pressurized all the time. So these folks are all in the portfolio, and I haven't touched the industry side. These are academic and either Navy or pseudo-Navy resources that the community can go work on. And I'd also tell you that what you did see a lot of that RDT&E budget is owned by the PEOs, and the PEOs typically send a lot of money to all these places also. But they're typically focused on the development that is needed to go take something out of R&D and get it into a project. So it's not basic research. This is a reading chart for you all in the back. There are 13. I've shifted gears now to what is a UARC. It's a university-affiliated research center. Okay, we are tied to a NAVC contract. We are not allowed to compete with the Lockheed Martins and Northrop Grumman's, et cetera, of the world. There are 13 of them across DOD. There's a DOD guide to how to use the UARCs. These are the 5 Navy UARCs. Johns Hopkins APL, Penn State ARL, University of Washington APL, University of Texas at Austin, and University of Hawaii, which was just stood up about 10 years ago on my watch as ComNavC. And you can see we each have our areas of specialties. I will tell you, very carefully written into our charters, we all work on cyber, just so you know. And so it's not written in, you won't see it as a competency anywhere, but we're all allowed to work on cyber. But again, we're as good as our last delivery, and we're as good as our next proposal. The nice thing about the UARCs is they generally sit on campus, so we have access to that basic unclassified research that's going on campus. We take it and we apply it, and it's suddenly TSSCI. It's kind of an interesting world to live in. When I look at what the UARCs do, over there on the left-hand side of this slide, you can see the 13. They're pretty selective when you compare to the 4,000 plus campuses that are around. Admiral Winter mentioned the Valley of Death. If you're a UARC person, those two, we view those as, at least in my world, is there a laser on here? see if I can blind everybody. Down here, getting something out of the basic discovery and innovation and into some prototyping, that's one very, very tough spot that is very difficult to make that transition. UARCs are actually pretty good at that because they sit right on campus, and we can go take that if we have a requirement out of our Navy or other sponsor that'll let us go off and do some prototyping. Likewise, the UARCs are not allowed to go be in production. We're in production on ATT right now, and I can't wait to turn that over to the private sector, because that's not our sweet spot. Getting the development done, getting the prototypes, take them out, run them, break them, fix them, get the drawing package squared away, and then transition them over to private sector so that the PEOs and PMs can go off and buy a bunch of whatever you've developed. That's another sweet spot, and it's also another very tough place to go when you look at the total acquisition process. So that's what I would say you use us for. Some things that, some thoughts I have for you, that are what are measures of success? First off, I said in the beginning of my talk that we're frenemies, right? Well, because we compete, depending on what the entity is. If it's missiles, there's one UARC involved. If it's torpedoes, there's another UARC involved. And typically, there's some overlap with the Navy warfare centers. And how we collaborate, cooperate, and compete for ideas on this is a political, I'll say it's a political challenge, but it's also a great strength to the R&D community when it's used properly. Those of us who are in the UARCs and the FFRDCs, we are actually symbiotic with the warfare centers because we kind of all need each other. The design agent roles that are in some of the UARCs versus the tech development authority in the warfare centers is a big deal. You need the adult supervision from a Navy entity to help you on your way. And then I guess the final thought here is rapid prototyping. It looks great, but there's usually something underlying in those 4 or 5 ways of doing this that I mentioned at the start of the lecture. That there ain't nothing that comes really fast unless it's maybe in the private sector. But for all these very complex defense technologies, you're either building on somebody's shoulders that was already laboring in the vineyards, or you're combining stuff, or you're adopting an old or existing platform to a new technology. So, good to talk. Looking forward to questions when you get to the end.
All right, so I'm a think tanker. I used to be in the Navy, but now I spend my time just pondering things all day and trying to make sure that we got funding. That's all we have to do. So I work at CSBA, and we work on a lot of warfighting concepts and warfighting technology studies. So I want to talk about a study that we recently did for DARPA and some of the lessons it had with regard to how do we more effectively transition new technologies. That's something that technologists in industry as well as government are increasingly concerned about, not just because they want to make sure their stuff gets out there to the fleet or the warfighter, but also to make sure that these investments are worthwhile given that budget constraints we're likely to remain under. So if you go to I'm not going to go. I'll go to the next slide. So in this study for DARPA, we wanted to look at what were the factors that led to improved or less better probabilities of transition for new technologies. So to do that, we had to create a framework for how do we evaluate a new program to see what characteristics it has, and see if those characteristics, as they change, make it more likely to transition or less likely to transition. So we created this little rubric using a lot of the references that are out there, a lot of the research that's been done before us. We didn't create this from scratch, but sort of synthesized it from the best in breed. So what we did is we said a new technological transition or new technology incorporates a combination of the technology itself and then also the operating concept that the technology operates under. So if you think about a commercial example, Clayton Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma talks a lot about the disk drive industry and how new disk drives came along that were smaller but less capable than their predecessors on the big mainframes. But nobody thought they were very good because they weren't sufficiently capable. They didn't have a good enough quality to be able to be used in the existing applications. So until a new application came along that used a small disk drive like a microcomputer or the iPod, for example, there wasn't a need for this new technology to be harnessed. Well, that new operating concept of the MP3 player or the iPod, combined with this new technology of the not very capable but very small hard drive, created this new technology, this new capability that transitioned. So on the one hand, you got technology, on the other hand, you got the operating concept. And so you either have an operating concept that's evolutionary, meaning I'm only going to modestly change how we operate today when I incorporate this new technology. Or I can have a revolutionary concept, meaning I'm going to dramatically change how we operate in the future based on the introduction of this new technology. And then the new technology can be highly disruptive in its own right because it's just so dramatically different than what we have today. So I'll talk about some examples. And then a sustaining technology, which is just a moderately improved version of the technologies we use now. So some examples that I have on here are over here on in the yellow. Those are technologies that were pretty disruptive in their own right, regardless of how we chose to use them. So Global Hawk, large, long endurance, high altitude, unmanned vehicles. Pretty disruptive technology, but the operating concept that we're going to use it in is pretty evolutionary. We're going to use the Global Hawk essentially like we'd use a U-2, at least from the Air Force perspective. The counter to that might be NIFCA. So down here you got a revolutionary concept, so I'm going to use integrated fire control, but the technologies I'm going to take to harness and put together in it are not that much different than what I already had. So I was pursuing some of these technologies like CEC and the TTNT data link already. I'm going to combine them in a new operating concept that gives me a new capability. So we created this framework to evaluate new technologies, new proposed programs to see which ones are more likely and which ones are less likely to transition. And we applied this looking at DARPA's programs, which I won't talk about because they're not ready for me to talk about that publicly yet, and also to ONR's programs. And so this chart shows every ONR FNC that was started and pursued between 2003 and 2011. I stopped in 2011 because that would enable things to transition. If a program that was started after 2011 would be almost impossible to transition by last year. So the type of transition that was pursued is indicated up in the top here. So the red ones are the very difficult to transition combinations of very disruptive technology with a really revolutionary operating concept. And the green ones down here are the really easy to transition ones, which are an evolutionary concept with a sustaining technology. So just a moderately improved version of what we have today. And so you can see over time the mix, if you will, of technology transitions that were pursued in the FNC programs has progressed from being all very relatively easy, relatively straightforward transitions to much more challenging transitions that are going to offer greater capability. So that's a good news story. And then if you look down here at the bottom, what's interesting is the rate of actual transition, the rate of successful adoption in a acquisition program. The rates are pretty high when you look back here in 2004 and 2005, so rates up to 100%, depending on which technology transition type you're evaluating. And then they go down over time. So what was interesting, a couple of results that came out of this were, first, we expect an FNC to take between 3 and 5 years to transition, and that's about as much time as we give it when we fund it and we have them have a technology transfer agreement. But it looks like these programs take at least 5 to 10 years to actually transition. So the time for a new technology to make it to an acquisition program could be double what we often predict it's going to be, and then we build programs around. So we need to kind of reevaluate how we fund S&T programs because they may take a lot longer to actually reach the warfighter than we've originally expected. Now, there's all kinds of, we can talk about some ways of how do we speed that up. But unless we recognize that reality, we're likely to have a lot of things sit in the moat, if you will, between S&T and acquisition program. The other thing that this revealed was the likelihood of transition for these very hard disruptive technologies and revolutionary concepts is pretty low. I mean, you can see they get up to 40% in a couple of years where there's a small number of them, but for the most part, they don't transition very quickly. But there's a lot of these type 2 transitions that make it through each year, and that's the combination of a disruptive technology and an evolutionary concept. So meaning I've taken some very new technology like the Global Hawk or stealth, and instead of saying I'm going to come up with some completely new way of fighting that leverages that new technology, I'm going to take the new technology and use it in an existing operating concept. So Global Hawk's going to do the same job as a U-2. The F-22 was designed to do the exact same job as the F-15 in the same way. And then once it gets out to the warfighter will start coming up with new ways to adapt it, and then new operating concepts will emerge out of that. So as a technologist, we should be thinking about introducing new disruptive technologies into an existing operating concept rather than trying to go for the full Monty and have a revolutionary concept that empowers that new technology. We also looked at how complex the new program or technology was. So whether it's a system of systems, like I created a whole systems of systems from scratch, and I'm going to transition this thing over to the warfighter who will now adopt it in toto, or is this thing just a subsystem, meaning I've got a component of a widget that goes into a larger system that I'm going to transition. So you'd think the subsystem is going to be easier to transition than the system of systems, because the complexity being higher just introduces so many more opportunities for somebody to say, I can't digest this thing, I can't use it, it's too hard for me to plug into my existing programs. And that's true. But what's interesting is that is a much smaller impact on the likelihood of transition than the type of transition. So the change or the difference in the likelihood of transition based on it being a system of system or a subsystem is only about half. That difference is only about half the difference that's imparted by a program that has a type 4 versus a type 1 transition. So if you want to think about increasing the likelihood of transition, it doesn't matter as much whether it's a system of systems or a subsystem. What matters much more is what kind of transition you're going to, the type 4 versus the type 1. So that was interesting too, in that to try to get, because people I think often assume that the complexity is going to be a much bigger driver than how disruptive the new technology is. And the disruption of the technology is not actually the biggest driver. So a couple of examples of we did some case studies as part of this study to evaluate how did some real world examples of a cradle to grave technology transition effort go, and what were some lessons that came out of them, and how does that relate back to our original thoughts regarding the role of systems or type of transition. So the LCS ASW mission package is one example. So originally, the ASW mission package for LCS is going to involve a revolutionary operating concept, meaning we're going to take all of our ASW sensors and take them off the ship, and they're going to be off doing ASW away from the ship. And then we would do engagements with remote capabilities like a helicopter. So the ship's not hosting the ASW sensors on board. So we're going to have the distributed systems, we're going to use unmanned vehicles, we're going to use helicopters for the most part. Well, that failed. We were pursuing new technologies that were very disruptive and revolutionary operating concepts, so it's a type 4 transition based on our rubric, and it didn't go well, and we had to totally dump it and adopt a new concept that was very traditional. So we went back to sonars that are going to be carried by the ship itself, helicopters that are going to then deploy weapons and sonars based on traditional operating concepts they have. And so we're back now to basically sustaining technologies that are out in the fleet now, the variable depth sonar, the multifunction towed array, and then an evolutionary, or rather than a evolutionary concept, which is doing ASW just like we do in the rest of the fleet. So we backed off of that original approach, which was type 4, to be a type 1 transition. And now that program is relatively on track. Another case is the LCS mine warfare, or mine countermeasures mission package. In this case, the little lines in here indicate the changes in this program over time and how it originally went from aspiring to introduce increments in 2007 through 2012 to now we're up to 2015 to 2019 for introduction of the increments of the various mission packages. So slow going, trying to adopt the technologies that were involved here. So originally, again, this was going to be a type 4 transition. So revolutionary operating concept, get the ship out of the minefield, everything's done remotely with disruptive technologies that are all unmanned and remote sensors. So Type 4 transition, very challenging again. Now, in this case, instead of backing off to a Type 1 transition, the lesson was when you do a Type 4 transition, when you're trying to do something revolutionary and disruptive, reduce the number of new technologies you have to adopt to the very, very minimum. So you should make your system of systems only incorporate the minimum number of new technologies. So originally, everything was new in the mine countermeasure mission package. It was all new technology that had to be developed from scratch. Over time, we have pulled out things that don't necessarily need to be new developments, the latest being the RMMV. So if the Navy goes from using the the multi-mission vehicle, which is an unmanned semi-submersible vehicle that's very new kind of a disruptive technology, to instead just using a common unmanned surface vehicle, that would be another example of going from bringing on new technology for the system and going to a relatively sustaining or adopted technology. So for system of system transitions, that was a key lesson that we learned there. So the big lessons that we came up with the study, both with the data we got from DARPA and with the data that we received from ONR and from the program offices, was we got to build the operating concept, and that's the key. So that the role of the operating concept in developing a new technological solution is absolutely essential. We often forget that. We often go after a new technology without thinking about how it's going to fit into an existing operating concept, or it may facilitate a new operating concept, and whether that's good or whether that's going to be disruptive and hard to transition. The next thing was increasingly we should be pursuing evolutionary concepts with the idea that eventually the technologies might facilitate a more revolutionary concept. So introduce the stealth fighter, but have it fight like an existing aircraft, and then later on let it take advantage of its stealth and adopt new operating concepts. Or have the nuclear submarine be introduced, and then figure out that we could actually put ballistic missiles on it and use it as a strategic deterrent platform. But don't try to go directly to that combination of the revolutionary concept with the disruptive technology. Use the minimum number of new technologies and focus those on the game-changing ones. And that was a key thing we brought out to DARPA was don't try to create the whole thing from the whole cloth, a new program. Instead, focus on the elements that really had to be developed new, and then use as much old or existing as possible. And then also this last one here is early and frequent interactions with the people who are going to buy the stuff or the people who are going to use the stuff. Oftentimes in the technology world, we get liquored up on a new technology, we get a little bit of interaction with people who might use it, and then boom, it's off to the races without periodically checking in to see if in fact the technology and the operating concept that we're thinking of is consistent with how warfighters would intend to fight with it. And so a project we're doing right now for DARPA is looking at that exact issue of how do we make sure that the operating concepts and new technologies incorporate are ones that are going to be feasible and executable in the field, especially in the environments we're likely to find ourselves in with anti-access capabilities, et cetera. So that's my talk, and so we can talk about more in the Q&A if you want to. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Admiral Carr, thank you for the invitation. Appreciate everyone's outlook and certainly working through lunch right here. I'm going to be able to provide a Coast Guard perspective in the context of everything else that we've heard here. Maybe how we see R&D, how we approach R&D, where we spend our time, and some other thoughts toward the end here. Certainly looking forward to your questions. But as a Coast Guard, we get to maintain an R&D program. A lot of the S&T R&D efforts in the Department of Homeland Security is consolidated in the S&T Directorate. And so we're one of the few agencies, entities that are able to maintain an R&D program. And we have a unique number of missions. And, we've been doing this for a number of times, a law enforcement element, national security, defense operations perspective. Certainly you think about search and rescue, ICE operations, ice breaking. As the chief acquisition officer now, I get to pay attention to how quickly we get to build the next big heavy icebreaker for the country. And so in the context of that and paying attention to what the Commandant in terms of his strategy lining up with the Western Hemisphere and cybersecurity and certainly the Arctic, again, we have to look at those few precious investment opportunities that we have. And again, the Coast Guard, somewhat unique in that, again, military, government, law enforcement, again, with a security aspect of it. We're regulators, we're first responders, we're local, we're national, we certainly have international presence. And so how do we look at that broad spectrum to be able to enhance and enable operations, and certainly show some level of effectiveness? Over the years, the program has developed some niches over time. Certainly we think of spill and oil spill responses, oil and water, in terms of how to respond to that, and certainly how to prevent that. Navigation on the water in terms of aids and navigation, using electronic aids as well. And search and rescue, again, a very important aspect of trying to find things and people in the water, understanding tactics and procedures, looking at technology, making sure that we apply them just right, search widths, durations, making sure that we maximize our probability of success when we go out and do those searches. And that's constantly evolving as new technology comes out and the new assets that we use currently come out. So, again, very fascinating, again, over time to be able to do that. So when I talk about the R&D program, we've got a small element headquarters that does budgeting and program. We have a lab, per se, an R&D center in New London, Connecticut. We've got about 100 folks there, 20 of them or so uniformed members. And they certainly are not lab folks in terms of walking around in white jackets doing basic or fundamental research. I acknowledge the importance for basic research. I'm a fan of basic research. But what you heard up here, you heard a lot of numbers being thrown out. With the B behind some of those numbers is in billions. I will tell you, in terms of the R&D program, we have been in the 18 to 20 million range in terms of our program. And by the time I pay for leases and lights and salaries, not a whole lot for those actual investments. And so, again, all for it, but we're all about leveraging. We're all about applied research and development. And so over time, what does that mean? We saw a technology readiness level on the chart, one of the previous charts. We sit in that 6 or 7 range. Not necessarily a lot of prototyping, but a lot of demonstration. And so when I think about the R&D program, we're cognizant, or we constantly try to work to be aware of technology and its application to our mission. But what we're really after, as we look at the R&D program, is knowledge, really about knowledge and the application of technology in terms of how we buy down risk or how we improve operations, both from effectiveness or efficiency. And so we're constantly doing that, again, with a few investments. I will offer that if you go to CG9, the acquisition website, you want to see where we're spending our time, we put all our programs out there. You can see where we're making those investments. The other thing that we're all about, we're about leveraging. Leveraging. I was talking to Admiral Winter over there. He's one of our great partners out there that we leverage constantly on a daily basis. ONR's one of our best friends. The Director of Science and Technology at the department, again, a great place that we leverage. One of the things that we just implemented was a S&T Transition and Innovation Center, where we're really looking at focusing on that transition piece. Again, a lot of it that we've talked about here. But maybe taking a little bit of a different approach of looking at functioning, capable things out in the field, maybe that CBP or FEMA or TSA is using, and seeing that its application in the Coast Guard, and seeing how that we can transition if we have to tweak it. Perhaps sharing that information as we demonstrate utility. One of the ones that we're looking at is that we go out in the maritime and there's vessels out there. Sometimes they want to be found. Sometimes we got to leave and come back and find them again. We got to mark them. And so, there is a lot of technology that you can apply to that in terms of GPS and sensors and things like that. So what do we do? How do we enhance that to transition so we get eventually a stock number on that? And so those are the kinds of things that we're paying attention to in terms of making sure that, again, using capability that's currently out there to enhance mission and operations. The other thing that the department stood up recently was this thing I called an IPT, and I think we all understand what IPTs, integrated process or product teams, but it's really looking at a very broad level across the department, where we're looking at requirements, interagency-wide, if you will, certainly within the department in terms of Customs Border Protection or TSA. But where we play in that is that we want to understand where technology might be able to provide a solution. We're trying to get on that early end of that in terms of using TRL level 6 type of technology to go out there to either assess or demonstrate the utility of that on the front end. And as we mature those requirements and we definitize what the capability is, as we get the knowledge, we're making sure, one, that it's feasible on the front end, and two, that it's affordable. That's the other thing that it's in our middle name. Not a lot of, again, B's in our equation where we sit in the United States Coast Guard. We heard from the university programs from a DoD perspective, but S&T, they have Center of Excellences out there, again, leveraging the university programs. And so they're probably up to about 15. They're constantly adding different universities to the COE program. Most recently, it was the Arctic Domain Awareness one, where, again, we're front and center. University of Alaska and Anchorage is the lead agency, but, again, across the spectrum, whether it's borders or coastal resilience, risk and risk assessment, maritime security. Again, like I said, number of 15 or 20, or I'd say 15 or 12 of those. And, again, much like in the university programs that Admiral Sullivan talked about, cyber is across all of them. And so we're constantly trying to leverage the knowledge and the capability that's out there. So where we're spending time, besides trying to leverage everybody else's good work and apply it to the maritime domain in terms of buying down risk and certainly driving a level of efficiency and effectiveness, is three main areas that the Commandant's really challenged us with. One is cyber. I think cyber is across the board. A lot of it is knowledge. There's a lot of capable work out there. Certainly we see cyber as enabling operations, but the other piece that's in the Coast Guard wheelhouse is protection of infrastructure. And so I mentioned that we have this regulatory role that we have with the maritime industry. So we're doing the front-end assessment of some of these ports, right, in terms of they got wireless access points. What does that all mean when they're out there and freely, readily available? Play that through. What's the vulnerability? What's the risk assessment? Really understanding the technology and providing that to industry. Again, trying to raise the level of awareness and perhaps, again, getting those right investments in place. The Western Hem, and again, if you get to listen to Admiral Zumkopf, he'll talk a lot about transnational organized crime and the ability for criminals to move drugs and other contraband throughout the Western Hemisphere and how that enables unaccompanied minors showing up at the borders, for example. So a lot of consequence. So we're trying to understand that too in terms of what is the real fleet force that we need to be able to address this flow of drugs. So again, we do model and simulation at the Coast Guard R&D Center in terms of a fleet mix. How many big capable Coast Guard cutters do we need with flight decks? How about ones that are maybe less capable or that are not as high-end as the national security cutter? How many patrol boats do we need? Where do we need to home port them? And then we run them through the simulation to drive to some level of understanding of what the effectiveness of that's going to be. One of the things that's really been pressed and certainly pursued, and again, doing a lot of leveraging, is small UAS, unmanned aerial surveillance vehicles that go up in the air. We've deployed a number of, in terms of demonstrations on our national security cutter. We've demonstrated utility on that. But how do we enhance that to make sure that industry and academia know really what we're pursuing here? I mean, I will tell you that operators will take any new toy capability that you will offer them, and they'll use it, and they'll just brag to infinitum about the utility of that. But we want to make sure that if we're going to put a small UAS, that it can fly as far as it needs to fly to make sure that it's being effective, that it has not just looking through a soda straw, if you will, but it can see wide and do that wide area surveillance. And so, again, we're just trying to understand the state of technology, make sure that we're articulating that need and making sure we're enhancing the operators when they finally do get those tools. And finally, the Arctic. Very challenging environment, very harsh, a lot of unknowns. Again, a lot of this has picked up considerably over the last 6 or so months, certainly, again, from a heavy icebreaker perspective, but certainly operating in that environment. So every year we send one of our cutters up there, and since we don't have lab coats at the R&D Center, we say that our labs are out in the field, and we're constantly out in the field working with our operators, understanding the mission, actually applying that technology and to see how effective it is. So again, communication is very challenging. This past year we looked at the whole range of satellite comms and various frequency of comms, line of sight, over the horizon. Certainly looked at the UAS, how that operates in that harsh environment. Too small could be very challenging. And, big wind knocks it right down, right? Too big, it kind of gets into the affordability and the logistics issues. And certainly, there's not a lot of infrastructure up there in Alaska, and so we have to look at how do we put landing parties, if you will, on shore. How do we make sure that we have very capable and sustainable landing craft over time? And again, we take it up there, and we have the opportunity to kind of test that out. And so, just kind of give you a context of how we see R&D. I mean, R&D, we've seen a whole spectrum of what that means in terms of basic research and prototyping, and so we sort of have a certain view of that and how we apply it. From my view, from the Chief Acquisition Officer, our role, our challenge is making sure that we articulate what that future need looks like, that requirement, and be able to invoke or excite industry, academia to kind of look at these issues and problems, perhaps make those investments at the basic or the fundamental research. And so when they become mature, we're going to be at the ready to be able to take it, put it into the maritime environment, put it into the operators, increase our knowledge, and really make those good decisions in terms of assessments of, hey, that's an investment that we want to go after. And we'll hand it over to the PEO to make that investment. So I appreciate your time and the opportunity to share a perspective, and see if you have any questions. Admiral Carr, back to you. So.
Well, thank you all. As you would expect, we've ran a little over, but we do have some time for questions. And I would ask you to think of short questions because my moderator bonus is tied directly to the number of questions I'm able to get through. I did make some observations. I'm going to crystallize them down to just a couple quick points that I want to make. Crossover, first of all, Admiral Winter, you're domain agnostic, particularly your parallel between what came out of railgun and the other applications for that. Well, that really resonated with me. And thinking about sometimes the hardest thing is to introduce ourselves to ourselves within our own organization. Where do you draw the circle around an organization? Dr. Gambier, great illustration, and thank you very much, but it got me thinking about, we get hammered so much in the government on transition rates. Does industry track them in the same way? And I would just sort of toss out rhetorically, what is the industry transition batting average compared to the government batting average that's so trackable because it's public? Admiral Sullivan, your ATT example, I lived that, and the other side of that story, from my perspective in getting beat up, as we coiled that spring over the years so that it was ready to go kabong when you pulled the trigger on it. The other side of that was we were getting criticized heavily because the appearance was we were drip funding it, and it was never going to go anywhere. It was always 5 years away. When in reality, it was great work. Penn State was doing awesome work. We just never really pulled the trigger with dollars until we got Admiral Greenert in a plane, flew to Penn State. That optic and his interest really pushed it over the goal line, and now it's a success. Brian, your transition matrix, I would just say that very intriguing. It struck me as I watched it as there's a third axis there of capability. So that in each of those squares, sometimes you get capability, and then of course there's capability per dollar, which might be something worth exploring. Because sometimes you spend a little bit, but you get a lot. And then finally, Admiral Vavidich, thanks, and we certainly all appreciate your unique perspective and your unique location at that intersection between law enforcement and warfighting and military. And if anybody has to live the leverage life, you do. So That was very poignant, thanks. And I have a couple questions, but I'll open it to you all first. Anybody got a question? Sir?
I'm Carl Gottsmer from the Naval Surface Warfare Center. This question is addressed to Admiral Winter and in general the whole panel. As I look around this room, it's not exactly a young college crowd, and including myself. So, you know, in your S&T strategy, how are you going to be addressing the workforce development, as I see a major problem for not just O&R, but in general for this whole country?
I'm going to have to ask you to, can you articulate that workforce development?
Yeah, in other words, I see...
I couldn't understand it.
I see that, you know, if you look around the warfare centers and even in this room, we have kind of a sunset crowd. And what I'm saying is that, you know, how do we invigorate keep the S&T going and your strategy at O&R when I see a workforce that's really aging. And I think it's a major mentoring issue, but also the country is not really graduating a whole lot of engineers these days compared to, say, you know, business majors, you know.
So I'll jump on that, and then other panel members. As the Department of Navy STEM executive, but also the S&T, right, STEM, there you go, right? Remember, STEM spelled backwards is the Mets, and I'm a Yankees fan. So the focus on inspiring and engaging and in the pre-work, so we call our education initiatives, coupled with our workforce initiatives for awareness and retaining of our technical base, right? Yeah, we all have bimodal organizations. When you sit down, you look at your charts, governmental, you know, we had the non-hiring decade, 1990 to 2000. When you really look at the data, we graduate about 1.7 to 2 million technical STEM-ish type degrees in the United States. I'll just use the United States a year. The issue is that we need to inspire not only graduates but postdocs and workforce on the value of public service. I look at the 1.7 to 2 million graduates, and when you look at the survey data, about 30% are interested in public service. So we don't even start out with the total denominator of technical degrees. And that's not a bad thing, it's just an observation. But when you start talking about human capital and understanding not what skill sets, but the population of skills to maintain and strategically identify initiatives, right, instead of just shotgunning, you got to do that critical thinking. And in that critical thinking, you got to understand where you are. And our as-is across the Naval Research Development Establishment, right, we're actually pretty well off when you look at it from a holistic perspective. But that doesn't mean we can sit on our laurels. The work we do, not just the S&T work, but in the engineering, the logistics, the test, the fleet support across the Warfare Center, System Centers, the laboratories, UARCs, FFRDCs, it's eye-watering work. It's interesting work. We have about a 7% attrition rate across the complete NR&DE. That's retirements as well as people not wanting to work in there anymore. Okay. So what are we doing to maintain the flow of qualified, competent workforce, as we also need to build new skill sets? Cyber analysts, for example, right? Cyber analysts is a concern for me because they're not just IT guys, right? Cyber analysts need to be mechanical, electrical engineers that understand combat systems and system of systems architecture that then can talk about the cyber domain and when we analyze these systems, right? So those types of initiatives we're already establishing with the DAS and RDT&E team to engage in building those skill sets while continuing to inspire through our STEM work the next generation of STEM and STEAM, putting arts in there to bring forward the next generation of leaders. But it takes the whole village, it takes the whole community, it takes all of us, right? My daughter's a music choir director in a middle school, and I'm very proud of her. And I go talk with her and engage with her and her students, because some people say, well, she's lost cause. She's a Bachelor of Science in Music, right? I go, she's going to have eventually grandchildren, going to have kids. You want people to understand the value of the technological thought process of solving problems. So we have challenges. We've got challenges with international domains and security clearances and so forth. But right now, what will continue to move us forward is making sure that we inspire, we lead, and we give our workforce the recognition and the accountability they deserve, so they want to keep working for us. Those are my thoughts.
2 million high school graduates every year, roughly. About half of them go to college. About half of them major in something technical, begin to major in something technical. Less than half of them graduate in that technical discipline, and a tiny fraction of them go on to an advanced degree, and a tiny fraction of them are eligible for a clearance. So it's not a very pretty graph. It's a real challenge. And we also need to think differently maybe about international students who comprise over half the advanced degrees awarded in this country as of about 4 years ago. So, other questions? We're almost out of time. Admiral Sullivan, would you talk a little more about, may I ask you about mission funded versus working capital funding? Have we got the mix about right there, or could we do better?
Am I on? Yeah. Okay. So I'm talking strictly to the warfare centers now as a former NASC commander, and they're 100%, as far as I know, working capital funded. So it's no ticky, no laundry. They're very close to the UARCs in terms of soft money. Now they tend to, cultivate repeat customers. They get a lot of their money from the PEOs because that's where the PEOs go to get the technical work done. Having said that, my sense in owning the warfare centers for a long time in my life was that we could never seem to migrate down the food chain towards the 6-1, 6-2 arena because the PEOs don't have that kind of money. And again, Admiral Winter, $2 billion a year. You compare the Coast Guard, that's huge. I got that. But when you compare the suite of things that we are trying to do in the United States Navy across multiple disciplines, it's pretty hard to go pull money out of basic research at the universities and just say, okay, I'm going to go send that to a warfare center for an unspecified piece of work. I would say at some point, the warfare centers, in order to be a little bit more independent and to maybe grow some more world-class, top-of-the-field PhDs, would need maybe at least somewhere in the mix, some mission-funded. When they were laboratories, they were mission-funded. We brought them over. We put them on working capital fund. And when you're a working capital funded activity, you've got to be responsive to the folks who send you your money. So that's both good and bad because it keeps you attuned to your customer. On the other hand, if you want to go off into a new area, it's pretty hard to get money to go do that. So it's a tug of war. I would like to see a slight mix where we'd at least fund some core mission areas in the warfare centers under mission funding.
Thank you. You want to add anything?
So not to disagree with my esteemed colleague, but as a previous warfare center commander and a program manager in a PEU who has sent the money, and now the mad scientist of the Navy, I believe that the working capital activity, right, because it's not a fund, it's a debt, provides the flexibility to build new skill sets where needed. I agree with Admiral Sullivan in his hypothesis that with the customer that comes, you have to meet the customer's need. But there's opportunity in the Warfare Center commander's prerogative to be able to build new skill sets. Some new authorities from 2009, the 219 authority that provides now somewhere in the neighborhood of in the hundreds of millions of dollars across the department. There's opportunity there. Now, on the other side of the coin, CNR, I give NRL mission funding. So they are combined. So there's somebody out there who's going to say, well, Admiral Winter, you're sort of talking out of two sides of your face. There is balance with mission funding. The concern with mission funding is it is more vulnerable to the marks for higher priority activity. And so that's my concern about having it 100% mission funded. But a balanced mission funding and working capital activity, I think, is an appropriate strategy.
I agree with that.
All right, we have time for one closing thought. So I would ask Dr. Gambier about IRAD. And one of your responsibilities at the company is the internal allocation of IRAD, and a common theme that I remember hearing in uniform and out is how do we communicate better on IRAD? So do you have any thoughts there as we wrap up on how we have that conversation with the government?
So I think taking the large view and really, I always use the word portfolio approach. And you asked Nevin about return on investment. It varies by industry. A common figure is about 3x. So for every dollar you put into R&D, over time you can trace $3 of value back to that dollar. But the reason I use the term portfolio, and probably my colleagues do too, is that it's often the success of the few that justifies the program as a whole. You get enough home runs, you don't need many of them, and it justifies every dollar of investment you've made. And you get some singles and doubles and triples along the way, but not every program has to be successful, Just a few really big successes will justify the whole program.
Thank you. Okay, thanks for attending, and thank you for the panelists taking time out of your busy day.